The air in Miller's John Deere dealership hung thick and heavy, a cloying mix of fresh green paint, curing rubber, and the faint, sharp scent of ambition. It was the kind of smell that got into a man's clothes and followed him home, a reminder of things he didn't have. Silas Blackwood stood on the polished concrete floor, his worn work boots looking like relics from another age against the showroom shine. It was April of 1972, and the pressure was on. In the center of the room, under a dozen buzzing fluorescent lights, sat the reason for the pressure. A brand new John Deere 44430. It was a monument of modern farming, a fortress of steel and glass, with a decal on the side that screamed progress. Its Soundguard cab was a thing of wonder, a sealed bubble of quiet comfort with tinted windows, a radio, and even an air conditioner. Frank Miller, the owner of the dealership, circled the machine like a proud father. He was a man in his mid-30s, soft in the way men who work with paper instead of iron get soft. His hands were clean, his green John Deere polo was starched, and his smile was as wide and calculated as the financing terms he was about to offer. "Look at her, Silas," Frank said, slapping a massive rear tire that still had the rubber nubs on it. 125 horses at the PTO, turbocharged. 16 forward speeds with the quad range. This isn't just a tractor, it's an investment in your future. You're farming what, 1,000 acres now? Your 4020 is a good machine, a classic, but it's tired. It's costing you time, and time is money. Silas didn't say anything. He ran a calloused thumb over a deep scar on his knuckle, a permanent souvenir from a slipped wrench on his old Farmall M. He looked past the gleaming new tractor to his own, parked just outside the big plate glass window. His 1968 John Deere 40-20 sat there in the spring sunlight, its paint faded to a soft, honest green. There were dings on the fenders and a dark stain of diesel near the fuel cap. It had no cab, just 2 fenders and a clamshell seat that had molded itself to his frame over thousands of hours. It was paid for. Every bolt, every gear, every drop of oil in it was his. "The bank is eager to work with farmers like you, Silas," Frank continued, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "Good land, good reputation. We can roll the cost of this beauty into an operating note, stretch the payments out. You'll make it back in 1 good harvest, maybe 2. Think of the efficiency. You can pull a bigger plow, a wider disc, get your corn in 3 days earlier." Silas finally looked at Frank. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, clear and uncompromising. "And what's the interest on that note, Frank?" Frank waved a dismissive hand. "Don't you worry about the numbers. The numbers work. Everybody's doing it. Tom Haskins just traded his 40-20 in on a 46-30, bigger than this one. Said he's picking up another 160 acres north of you. You know the old Miller place. You don't want to get left behind." "Tom Haskins can do as he pleases," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm not Tom Haskins. My father farmed through the 30s, Frank. He taught me 2 things: trust the land and fear the bank. In that order." A flicker of annoyance crossed Frank's face. "This isn't the 30s, Silas. This is 1972. We put men on the moon. You can't farm with a horse and buggy mentality anymore. It's get big or get out. President Nixon himself is saying it." "I'm not getting out," Silas stated, the words as solid as the anvil in his shop. "And I'm not signing a note that puts a lien on the land my grandfather broke with a team of mules." He walked over to the new tractor and placed a hand on the cool, unblemished sheet metal of the hood. He could feel no life in it, no history. It was just a machine, a product. His 4020 felt different. It had a pulse, a memory of every furrow it had ever turned, every seed it had ever planted. That old 4020 of yours. It's got what? 8,000 hours on it? Frank scoffed. It belongs in a museum. What happens when the power shift goes out in the middle of planting? You'll be down for a week waiting on parts. With this, he patted the 40430 again. You get a warranty. Something breaks, my mechanic is out there the same day. If something breaks on my tractor, I fix it, Silas said simply. He took his hand off the new machine and wiped it on his jeans as if to clean off the scent of debt. I appreciate the coffee, Frank, but my answer is no. He turned and walked toward the door. A few other farmers who had been pretending to look at planter parts fell silent, their eyes following him. He could feel their judgment, their whispers. Old man Blackwood, too stubborn for his own good, thinks he knows better than everyone. As Silas stepped out into the bright, cool air, Frank's voice followed him, sharp with frustration. You're a fool, Silas, a damn fool. In 5 years, you'll be lucky to be farming your own garden patch, while men like Tom Haskins are running this whole county. Silas didn't turn around. He just climbed into the cab of his faded blue Ford F-250. The vinyl of the bench seat cracked and familiar. He fired up the big V8, its rumbling idle a comforting sound. As he pulled out of the dealership lot, he glanced in his rearview mirror. He saw Frank Miller standing there with his arms crossed, shaking his head, already turning his attention to a younger farmer with more ambition and less memory. Driving down the gravel road back to his homestead, the dust billowing behind him, Silas felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. It wasn't pride, not exactly. It was something deeper, a conviction rooted in the lessons of hardship. He knew what it was to own something, truly own it, and the peace that came with it. And he knew the gnawing fear that came with owing, a fear that could eat a man alive from the inside out, no matter how shiny his new tractor was. Before we get too deep into this story, I have to stop and ask you folks a question. Have you ever known a man like Silas? The kind of man who'd rather spend a week with grease up to his elbows rebuilding a transmission than spend 5 minutes signing a banknote? Let me know down in the comments, because I have a feeling that men like him are a dying breed, and their stories need to be told. The confrontation with Frank Miller left a bitter taste in Silas's mouth that lingered for days. It wasn't the insult that bothered him. He'd been called a fool before. It was the condescending pity in the eyes of his neighbors, the sense that he was being written off as a relic. But there was no time to dwell on it. Spring was a promise that had to be kept, and the land didn't care about dealership gossip. He spent the next week in his shop, a long, tin-roofed building that smelled of diesel, welding rods, and damp earth. He gave the 4020 its spring physical. He changed the oil, the big canister filter dripping thick, black 30-weight into the drain pan. He pulled the fuel filters, replacing the paper elements and bleeding the air from the lines until he heard the injectors crackle with life. He greased every Zerk fitting, watching the old dirty grease push out, replaced by a clean, amber bead of new life. He checked the tires, the fluid levels, the fan belt. He treated the machine not as a tool, but as a partner. Then, on a perfect Tuesday morning, with the sun just beginning to burn the dew off the alfalfa, it happened. He was in the North 80, pulling the 24-foot disc, turning over the corn stubble from the year before. The 4020 was singing its deep, throaty diesel song, the black smoke puffing from the stack in a steady rhythm with the engine's labor. The rich Iowa soil rolled over the disc blades, dark and fragrant. It was the kind of work that settled a man's soul. He was on his third pass when he felt it. A slight hesitation, a shudder that ran through the whole frame of the tractor. He pulled back on the throttle, listening. The engine sounded fine, running smooth as ever. He shifted the synchro range lever from 6th gear down to 5th. As he let out the clutch, there was a sickening lurch, followed by a high-pitched grinding sound that made the hair on his arms stand up. It was the sound of hardened steel teeth shearing off, of a catastrophic failure deep in the guts of the machine. He slammed the clutch to the floor and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the chirping of a meadowlark on a fence post. He sat there for a long minute, his heart sinking into his stomach. Frank Miller's words echoed in his head. What happens when the power shift goes out in the middle of planting? This wasn't the power shift model, it was the simpler synchro range, but the result was the same. He was dead in the water. Getting the tractor back to the shop was an ordeal. He had to walk the 2 miles home, get the old Farmall M, and drag the dead 420 and the disc out of the field and back to the farmstead. The little Farmall, with its narrow front end and sputtering gas engine, strained and spun its wheels, a testament to a bygone era of farming. But it got the job done. That evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the yard, a new pickup truck pulled in. It was Tom Haskins. He rolled down the electric window of his shiny new Ford, the cab of which was still pristine. "Heard you had some trouble, Silas," Tom said, not quite managing to keep the note of satisfaction out of his voice. He gestured with his chin toward the silent 4020. "Transmission?" Silas nodded, wiping his greasy hands on a red rag. "Sounds like it." "Tough break. Right in the middle of planting, too," Tom said, shaking his head with mock sympathy. "Frank Miller told me he could have a loaner out to you by tomorrow morning. Keep you on schedule. Of course." He paused. "The rental rate's pretty steep this time of year." The unspoken message was clear. You should have listened. You should have bought the new one. "I'll manage," Silas said, his voice tight. "Manage how?" Tom pressed. "You can't plant 1,000 acres with that little M. By the time you get that 40-20 fixed, if you can even get the parts, you'll have missed your window." "I said I'll manage," Silas repeated, his gaze hardening. It was one thing to be proven wrong by a machine. It was another to have his neighbor, a kid half his age who farmed with the bank's money, rub his nose in it. Tom shrugged, a smirk playing on his lips. "Suit yourself. Just trying to help." He powered up his window and drove off, his new truck quiet and smooth, leaving Silas alone in the twilight with the silence of his broken machine. The next morning, the real work began. Splitting a tractor the size of a 40-20 is not a job for the faint of heart. It is a greasy, heavy, brutal surgery. He backed the tractor into the shop, positioning it under the main I-beam where his chain hoist was mounted. First, he drained the lifeblood of the hydraulics and transmission, nearly 15 gallons of thick, honey-colored high-guard fluid that gurgled slowly into a series of 5-gallon buckets. Then came the disassembly. He disconnected the fuel lines, the throttle linkage, the wiring harness, the hydraulic lines that fed the steering and the remote outlets. Each connection was coated in a decade of grime. Each bolt fought him with rust and resistance. His knuckles were raw within the first hour. The hardest part was building the splitting stands. He welded them himself out of heavy channel iron, creating 2 sturdy frames on caster wheels, one to support the engine and front end, the other to hold the transmission housing. With the tractor supported by the stands and the hoist, he began the slow, deliberate process of removing the massive bolts that held the 2 halves of the machine together. They were 1.5 inches thick, torqued down with hundreds of foot-pounds of force. He had to use a 4-foot cheetah bar on his biggest socket wrench, his whole body straining against it until each bolt gave way with a deafening crack. Finally, with the last bolt out, He began to slowly, carefully, roll the front half of the tractor away from the back half. The machine opened up like a giant iron clam, revealing the clutch, the pressure plate, and the input shaft of the transmission. The smell of gear oil, sharp and pungent, filled the entire shop. He had successfully split the tractor. It was a monumental task, but it was only the beginning. Now he had to dive into the transmission itself, a complex maze of gears, shafts, and bearings, to find the source of the failure. He worked late into the night, the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long, dancing shadows. The silence of the farm broken only by the clang of steel on steel. The years that followed the transmission rebuild were, for most farmers in the heartland, a golden age. The great Russian grain deal of 1972 had opened the floodgates. Commodity prices, which had been stagnant for years, shot into the stratosphere. Corn went from $1.50 a bushel to $3, then $3.50. Soybeans followed suit. The government's message, echoed by university agronomists and bankers alike, was clear and seductive. Plant fence-row to fence-row. And they did. All around Silas, the world was changing. Old farmsteads were bulldozed, the groves of trees that had sheltered families for generations pushed into piles and burned to make way for a few more rows of corn. Fences came down, pastures were ploughed under, the landscape flattened out into a vast, unbroken sea of green and gold, a monoculture of pure profit. Frank Miller's dealership became the epicenter of this new prosperity. He couldn't get tractors and combines in fast enough. The waiting list for a new John Deere 4840 or an 8820 combine was a year long. The price of the equipment seemed to climb every month, but nobody blinked. The money was just too good. Frank expanded his showroom, built a new service bay, and hired 4 new mechanics. He drove a Cadillac to work and took winter vacations in Florida. Tom Haskins was Frank's star pupil. He'd bought the old Miller place, and then the quarter section next to that. By 1978, he was farming close to 2,000 acres. His equipment lineup was a sight to behold. 2 massive 4640s with duals, a brand new 8820 combine with a 24-foot grain head, and a fleet of new trucks to haul the grain to the elevator. He was one of the first in the county to put up a harvestor silo. Its brilliant blue form, a towering monument to his success. He was leveraged to the hilt, everyone knew it. But in the boom years, debt was just another word for opportunity. Silas watched it all from his quiet corner of the county. He'd gotten the 4020 back together after a grueling 2 weeks. The problem had been a sheared pinion gear on the B-range countershaft. He'd ordered the parts from a specialty catalog out of Nebraska and, with the help of a well-worn service manual, had painstakingly reassembled the complex gearbox. When he finally torqued the last bolt and turned the key, the tractor fired up and ran sweeter than it had in years. He'd lost 10 days of planting time, but a warm, dry May allowed him to catch up. His yield that year was a little lower than his neighbors, but his costs were a fraction of theirs. The high grain prices of the mid-70s were a windfall for him, too. But his reaction was profoundly different from everyone else's. While Tom Haskins was signing papers for more land and bigger iron, Silas took his profits and drove into town to the First National Bank. He walked past the loan officers' desks, ignoring their eager smiles, and went straight to the teller. He paid off the last $7,000 of the mortgage on his original homestead, the one his grandfather had bought. The teller, a young woman who couldn't understand why someone would pay off a low-interest loan ahead of schedule, had to fetch the bank manager to find the deed. When the manager handed him the document, stamped "paid in full," Silas felt a sense of security that no new tractor could ever provide. He owned his land, free and clear. The rest of his profits went into United States savings bonds and certificates of deposit, safe, boring investments that paid a steady, if unspectacular, return. To the rest of the community, he was an enigma, a ghost from a past they were trying to outrun. He was a failure in the language of the new era. At the co-op, the talk was of bushels per acre, of land prices doubling in 5 years, of who was buying the next big tractor. Silas's name only came up in hushed tones, usually followed by a shake of the head. Poor old Silas, they'd say. Still running that 40-20. Could have been a millionaire by now if he wasn't so scared of his own shadow. He felt their scorn, but it didn't move him. He kept his own counsel. His days were governed by the rhythm of the seasons, not the Dow Jones Industrial Average. He maintained his equipment with a watchmaker's precision. The Farmel M still handled the light-duty chores, its engine sputtering along faithfully. The 40-20, with its rebuilt transmission, was the heart of the operation, pulling the plough and the planter with unwavering reliability. He knew every sound it made, every vibration. He could tell by the pitch of the engine when the soil was getting heavy, or by the feel of the hydraulic lever when the disc was sinking too deep. He was debt-free, a status so alien in the late 1970s farm economy that it was almost shameful. He slept soundly at night, untroubled by thoughts of variable interest rates or margin calls. Yet, in the eyes of his peers, he was the one who was struggling. One evening in the fall of 1979, Silas was in his shop, sharpening the blades on his sickle bar mower. The radio on the shelf was tuned to WMT out of Cedar Rapids, the farm report droning on in the background. He was just finishing the last blade, the file making a satisfying rasping sound against the steel when the news came on. The announcer's voice was grave. He spoke of runaway inflation, of the price of oil skyrocketing, and of a new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker, who was promising to break inflation's back, no matter the cost. He talked about something called the prime rate, the interest rate banks charge their best customers, and how it had just jumped to a shocking 15%. Silas put down his file. He walked over and turned up the volume. The announcer continued, explaining that this new policy meant that the interest rates on all loans, operating notes, equipment financing, mortgages, were about to climb to levels not seen in living memory. A cold knot formed in Silas's stomach. It was a feeling he hadn't had in years, a deep, ancestral dread passed down from a generation that had lost everything. He looked out the open shop door, across his fields of harvested corn stubble, toward the distant blue gleam of Tom Haskins's new silo. He saw the blinking red lights on top of the grain elevators in town. He saw an entire world built on the assumption that the good times would last forever, a world built on cheap money and ever-rising prices. And in the quiet hum of the radio announcer's voice, he could hear the sound of the foundation beginning to crack. The storm was coming. He didn't know when or how bad it would be, but he knew it was coming, and he knew that this time the price of progress was going to be paid in full. The summer of 1980 arrived like a judgment. The sky over Iowa turned a hard, unforgiving blue, and the rain simply stopped. Day after day, the sun beat down, baking the rich black soil into a cracked, grey pavement. The corn, which had shot up in the wet spring, began to suffer. Its broad leaves curled inward during the day, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture, giving the fields a spiky, withered look. Dust devils danced across the barren ground between the rows, carrying away precious topsoil. For men like Tom Haskins, who farmed 2,000 acres fence row to fence row, the drought was a slow-motion catastrophe. His massive, four-wheel drive John Deere 4640s bought on credit for their immense power, sat idle in the machine shed. There was no moisture to conserve with a cultivator, no weeds to spray. There was nothing to do but watch the sky and the commodity prices, both of which were falling. The Russian grain embargo, a political move made in a faraway capital, had slammed the door on the export market. Prices that had seemed perpetually high were now in freefall. Silas felt the drought's pinch, too, but his world was different. He had pasture land, a small herd of Hereford cattle that could graze on the deep-rooted alfalfa that was faring better than the corn. He had a large garden near the house, which his wife, Martha, watered painstakingly with a hose from their well. His 1,000 acres were suffering, but his entire existence wasn't tied to the price of a single commodity. His operating costs were a pittance compared to his neighbors. His fuel bill was manageable, and he had no equipment payments. The only note he had was on a small parcel of land he'd bought in '76, and the payments were fixed at a low rate. The first real crack in the new world appeared in late August. A single, violent thunderstorm rolled through the county, dropping an inch of rain in 20 minutes, and then moving on. It wasn't enough to save the crop, but it was enough to make the soybeans that had survived stand up straight. For a few desperate days, farmers ran their combines around the clock to salvage what they could. Tom Haskins's new 8820 combine, a machine that cost more than Silas's entire farm was worth a decade earlier, was a technological marvel. From its air-conditioned cab, Tom could monitor engine RPM, ground speed, and grain loss on a digital screen. It was a beautiful, efficient beast until it wasn't. On the second day of the harvest, in the middle of his best field of beans, it just quit. The engine ran, but the hydraulics that controlled the header and the threshing mechanism went dead. An angry red light flashed on the console, accompanied by a piercing alarm. Tom spent an hour checking fuses and fluid levels before giving up and calling the dealership. Frank Miller's best mechanic, a young man trained on the new electronic systems, spent half a day with a multimeter and a diagnostic computer. The verdict was grim. A central hydraulic control module, a sealed black box of circuit boards and solenoids, had failed. There wasn't one in stock in the state of Iowa. They could get one from the main depot in Moline, Illinois, but it would take 3 days, minimum. The cost, including the service call, would be over $2,000. As the mechanic's truck disappeared down the road, another line of thunderstorms was building in the west, promising hail. Tom Haskins stood in his surrounded by a sea of ready soybeans, his 6-figure combine as useless as a boulder. For the first time, Silas saw a look of genuine fear in the younger man's eyes. It was the fear of a man who is not in control, a man completely dependent on systems he doesn't understand and can't fix. At the dealership, things were even worse. The showroom, once buzzing with eager buyers, was now dead quiet. A fine layer of dust had settled on the hoods of the brand-new tractors. Frank Miller spent his days on the phone, not taking orders, but chasing payments. His voice had lost its confident, easy-going tone, replaced by a strained, wheedling edge. The high-interest loans he had so eagerly arranged were now anchors, pulling his customers under, and him with them. He had a yard full of repossessed equipment, tractors with barely 100 hours on them, planters that had seen only one season, that he couldn't sell for half of what was owed on them. The boom had been built on the promise of ever higher prices and easy credit. Now the foundation was gone, and the whole glittering structure was beginning to collapse. The winter of 1981 was bleak, but it was nothing compared to what followed. Paul Volcker's war on inflation was a success, but for the American heartland, the cure felt worse than the disease. The prime interest rate, which had seemed shocking at 15%, climbed to 18, then 20, then peaked at an unimaginable 21.5%. For farmers with variable rate operating loans, it was a death sentence. A note signed at 8% was suddenly demanding 20. The math simply didn't work. Corn was under $2 a bushel, and the cost of borrowing money to plant it was triple what it had been just a few years before. The foreclosure notices started appearing in the county paper, first as a trickle, then as a flood. They were printed in small, dense type, a weekly obituary for family farms, some of which had been in the same hands for over a century. The auctions began that spring. They were grim affairs, held in muddy farmyards under cold, grey skies. Neighbours came, not out of malice, but out of a grim necessity, their faces etched with the knowledge that their own auction could be next. They bid quietly on their friends' tools, their livestock, their machinery, the very pieces of their lives, hoping to get a bargain that might help them survive another year. Tom Haskins's auction was held on a bitter Saturday in April. The brilliant blue harvestor silo stood empty, a hollow monument to a shattered dream. His two massive 4640s, their tires caked with mud, brought less than half of what he owed on them. The 88-20 combine, with its recently replaced $2,000 hydraulic module, went for a fraction of its sticker price. Silas was there, standing at the back of the small crowd, his hands in his pockets. He didn't bid on anything. He watched as Tom stood by the porch of the farmhouse his wife had so lovingly decorated, his shoulders slumped, his face a pale, emotionless mask. He saw Tom's wife take their two young children inside, unable to watch as the auctioneer's rhythmic chant dismantled their life, piece by painful piece. There was no victory in it for Silas, only a profound and terrible sadness. He wasn't just watching a man lose his farm, he was watching a way of life die. Silas survived. He and Martha tightened their belts. They ate from the garden and the deep freeze, which was full of their own beef and pork. He welded cracks in his disc frame instead of buying a new one. He patched tires himself. He bought fuel in the off-season when it was a few cents cheaper. His life was governed by the principle of use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without. While the modern, leveraged world crumbled around him, his small, self-sufficient, debt-free island remained intact. He wasn't thriving, but he was holding on. He paid his taxes. He owned his land. In the devastating economy of 1982, that was the only kind of wealth that mattered. Frank Miller's dealership was the final casualty. The green and yellow John Deere sign that had been a beacon of progress and prosperity now seemed like a cruel joke. The bank that held his floor plan, the financing that allowed him to stock the new equipment, called his note. He couldn't pay. One morning, a fleet of flatbed trucks arrived and hauled away every new tractor, combine, and plow, leaving the showroom floor vast and empty. The dealership was closed. The dream was over. Frank, who had once lectured Silas about getting big or getting out, had gotten out. One evening, a week after the dealership had closed, an unfamiliar car pulled into Silas's lane. It was a dusty, 10-year-old Chevrolet, a far cry from the Cadillac Frank Miller used to drive. Frank got out. He looked smaller, diminished. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by the weary slump of a defeated man. He was wearing a simple work shirt and jeans, not his starched polo. He walked slowly toward the shop, where Silas was changing the oil on the 4020. The smell of warm diesel and fresh oil hung in the air. For a long moment, Frank just stood there, looking at the old tractor. Its green paint was faded and worn smooth in places from years of use, but it was clean, meticulously maintained. It was a survivor, just like its owner. "Silas," Frank said, his voice quiet, almost hoarse. Silas straightened up, wiping his hands on a red rag. He nodded. "Frank." "I came to ask you something," Frank stammered, his eyes fixed on the shop floor. "The bank took everything. The inventory, the building. But they don't want the old stuff. The tools, the service truck, a '74 Ford with the utility body and the crane on it. They said if I can sell it, the money's mine." He finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with a raw, desperate shame. "I know you don't owe me a thing. I know I was a fool. I called you a fool. But I was the fool." He took a deep breath. "I was wondering if you'd be interested in buying the truck and the tools. I'd give you a fair price. I need the cash to move my family." Silas looked at the man before him. He saw no trace of the arrogant salesman who had mocked him years ago. He saw only a broken man trying to salvage a piece of his life. There was no triumph in this moment, no satisfaction in being proven right. There was only the quiet, somber reality of the cost of pride. "What are you asking for it?" Silas asked, his voice even. Frank named a price. It was more than fair. It was cheap. Silas considered it for a moment, then nodded. "All right, Frank, I'll buy it. But I'll pay you what it's worth, not what you're asking." He named a figure $1,000 higher. Tears welled in Frank Miller's eyes. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He just nodded, a wave of gratitude and shame washing over his face. "I'll come by with a cashier's check tomorrow morning," Silas said. He turned back to the 4020, opened a new quart of 30-weight oil, and began pouring it into the engine, a simple, steady act in a world that had gone mod. The next week, Silas drove into town, not to the failed dealership, but to the First National Bank. He asked for the manager, the same man who had looked so surprised when he'd paid off his mortgage years earlier. He learned that the bank now owned Tom Haskins's home quarter, the original 80 acres with the house and the barns. They had taken it back after the auction failed to cover the debt. They were desperate to get it off their books. Silas made an offer, in cash. It was low, but in that economy, cash was king. The bank accepted without hesitation. A few days later, Silas drove his old Ford pickup down the gravel road to what had been Tom Haskins's farm. Tom was still there, living in the house as a renter, waiting for the bank to evict him. He was loading a few remaining possessions into a neighbor's trailer when Silas pulled up. Tom looked at him with weary defiance, expecting the final blow. "Haskins," Silas said, getting out of the truck. "I need to talk to you." "If you're here to kick me out, you can save your breath," Tom said, his voice brittle. "The bank already beat you to it." "I'm not here to kick you out," Silas said. He held out a piece of paper. It was the deed. "I bought the place. The house. The barns. This 80. Tom stared at him, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. "You what? You bought it? So you can plow my home under? So you can finally prove you were right all along?" "No," Silas said firmly. "I bought it because it's good land, and good land needs a good farmer." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I'm not going to farm it." "You are." Tom looked as if he'd been struck. "What are you talking about?" "I'm offering you a lease," Silas explained. "You farm this 80. You use my equipment if you need it. We'll split the crop, 60-40 in your favor, until you get back on your feet. You and your family can stay in the house. You pay me rent when you can." Tom Haskins, the man who had once smirked at Silas's old tractor, who had embodied the high-flying ambition of the boom years, stood speechless. He looked from the deed in Silas's hand to the old farmer's weathered face, searching for the trick, the angle. but he saw only a quiet, unyielding sincerity. The weight of the last few years, the pride, the fear, the humiliation, finally broke him. He sat down hard on the edge of the trailer and buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with silent, racking sobs. Silas stood there quietly, giving the man his dignity, watching as the sun began to set on the ruined landscape of the American heartland. By 1989, the land had begun to heal. The rains had returned and prices had stabilized. The scars of the crisis remained. Empty farmhouses stood like ghosts on the horizon, and the names on many mailboxes had changed, but a fragile sense of hope was returning. Silas was in his late 60s now, his movements slower, his face a roadmap of the seasons he had weathered. His farm was much the same. The service truck he'd bought from Frank Miller was parked in the shed, its crane a useful tool he never knew he needed. Tom Haskins was still farming the 80 acres, and 2 years prior he had started making regular rent payments. He was a different man, humbled and hard-working, his respect for Silas absolute. One Saturday afternoon, Silas was in the shop with his grandson, Daniel, a boy of 12 with his grandfather's quiet eyes. They were working on the 40-20, doing a routine tune-up. The boy was carefully setting the gap on a new set of injector nozzles, his small hands surprisingly steady. "Grandpa," Daniel asked, looking up from his work, "why do we still use this old tractor? Dad says we could afford a new one now. One with a cab and air conditioning." Silas stopped what he was doing and looked at the boy. He placed a hand on the tractor's faded green fender. The steel was warm from the afternoon sun. "Daniel," he said, his voice a low rumble. "There are two kinds of things in this world. Things that make you a living and things that own you. This tractor," he patted the fender, "it helps us make a living. We own it. Every bolt, every wire. When it breaks, we can understand it. We can fix it with our own 2 hands. It's honest steel. It'll work as hard as you do, and it won't ever lie to you." He looked out the open shop door, across the fields that stretched to the horizon. "Those new tractors, they're fine machines, but you don't own them, not really. The bank owns them. The computer company that makes their electronics owns them. You're just borrowing them, and you're paying for the privilege with a promise that the rain will always fall and the prices will always be high. It's a promise this land doesn't always keep." He turned back to his grandson. "Never borrow against what you can't afford to lose. Your land, your home, your name. You remember that. There's a difference between being rich and being free. A lot of folks around here learned that lesson the hard way." The boy nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He went back to his work, his movements more deliberate now, as if he were handling something sacred. Silas watched him for a moment longer, then walked to the doorway and looked out at his farm. The 4020, the machine he had been told was a relic, a fool's choice, had been his salvation. It was more than a tractor. It was a philosophy. It was a testament to a lifetime of quiet conviction. The sun was low in the sky, casting a golden light over the new growth in the fields. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves in the tall cottonwood trees by the house. He could hear Martha humming in her kitchen. In the distance, he heard the familiar, throaty rumble of a diesel engine as Tom Hoskins cultivated his corn. It was a good sound. It was the sound of survival. It was the sound of a debt paid in full.